r/no sleep. Posted by u/1_planch_man. Don't ever sleep in your car on a road trip. I'm from Connecticut. I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from Georgia, and would often make road trips down to visit her. I don't really mind, I love road trips. I've driven across the United States and back, all on my own. There's just something about traveling the highways of the US by yourself that's just so freeing. To save money, I would sleep in my car. It's not so bad, it's basically camping, in a metal tent. Makes you feel like you're really roughing it. I just recline the seat back, keep the key in the ignition just in case, and doze off. No, I don't put anything up to block the windows for privacy. Maybe I should have. The trip down south is a comfortable 2-day drive. My stop would usually be somewhere along the Virginia-North Carolina border. So for my previous trip, that's exactly where I stopped that night. Rest stops were often less trafficked and thus quieter than truck stops. Normally I would have stopped at a Love's, but I was so tired that I settled for the first rest stop I saw. It was oddly vacant that night, with only a couple of lone cars sitting forlorn under the amber street lamps. Most likely travelers with the same idea as myself. I pulled into a parking spot away from the others, under the shadow of a tree and far from the street lamps. I figured I would have more privacy there as opposed to being bathed in light. So, I did my usual thing, locked my doors, opened the window just a hair for ventilation, kept my key in, reclined the seat, and went to sleep. I was never interrupted on any of these car camping nights. So I never suspected anything on this one. Then a sharp tap woke me up. At first I thought I had heard it in my dream. I opened my eyes, a bit confused. Since I was leaned back, I was facing the ceiling and couldn't see anything. I hear another tap. Like a tiny object hitting a hard surface. It came in an irregular rhythm. Was it raining? Was water dripping onto my windshield? I'm under a tree, maybe something fell from the branches. Maybe a squirrel or a bird was dropped something. What if a squirrel was climbing around my car? Or what if it wasn't an animal? The thought occurred to me that it might very well be a person poking around outside. What did they want? Were the doors locked? Yes. The keys were in the ignition. I can leave in an instant. Still, I lay there, completely still, pretending to be asleep. Pretending I hadn't heard anything. Hoping whoever it was, they would leave me alone. It was better to not find out. I was too afraid to find out. It was better to stay here in blissful ignorance. Still the tapping continued. I had to do something. There was no way I was just going to stay there. I had to look. My heart was pounding. In that moment, it was deafeningly loud. Whoever was out there could probably hear it. I decided. I was going to look. I was going to raise my head up and see what was making the noise. So that's what I did. What met my eyes sent a jolt through entire body. Every muscle fiber locked up in pure shock at what I saw. The faint glow of the street lamps cast just enough light for me to make out what I'm looking at. There in the windshield, staring directly at me, was a face. Someone, I presumed to be a woman, was lying on my hood, her face pressed right up against my windshield. Her face was completely still, locked in a permanent grin. I froze in overwhelming terror. The eyes I stared into appeared to have rolled back, showing only the whites. The nose was turned up, pressed painfully into the glass. The lips stretched wide, revealing horrid rotten teeth. Even in the darkness, I could tell her skin was sickly pale, contrasting her long, filthy black hair. Whoever this was, she was clearly not in her right mind. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Finally, I got a grip on myself and shot my hand to the ignition. It turned over, making, in that instant, the most beautiful sound I ever heard. For a split second, I was afraid I might be caught in a horror movie scenario, the one where the car won't crank as the killer approaches. I reversed as fast as I could, trying not to give this creeper time to try anything. In my panic, I remember activating the windshield wipers in a futile attempt to get her off. I thought, was I about to drive out of here with some wacko holding onto my hood? Thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that, because as soon as I stopped, the woman leapt off, landing on all fours. Seeing my opportunity, I shifted into drive and gunned it, right as I saw her reaching for the driver's side door. With my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot. Behind me, I heard her let out a piercing shriek like that of an animal. I looked in my rearview mirror and for a split second I thought I saw her chasing me, running on all fours, her black hair swinging wildly around her. I couldn't get a good look, as I rounded a curve in the road leading out of the rest stop and merged with the highway. There, I picked up speed, and drove through the night. I did not dare stop again until I saw the morning light. Posted by u/1_planch_man. If you see someone waving you down on a desolate highway, don't stop. I was on an assignment for the Army, making my way up from San Antonio, Texas, to Tacoma, Washington. It was a long drive, and they gave me 6 days to report to my new unit, but I didn't mind. I love road trips. There's nothing like the freedom of exploring the world by yourself. The first day of my journey, I planned to get as much driving in as possible so I could spend a few days in Utah, a sort of mini vacation, you could say. This was January, and the days were short, so maximizing the amount of daylight I had was crucial. I got up extra early that morning, carried the last of my bags out to my Corolla, signed out of my old unit, and hit the road at roughly 5 a.m. It was an amazing day. I saw the landscape transform around me as I headed farther west than I had ever been in my life. From the San Antonio metropolitan area, to the savannas of the Edwards Plateau, to the pancake flat farmland of the Great Plains region, America's breadbasket. Finally, the farms opened up into prairie and I saw the "Welcome to New Mexico" vertical bar, the land of enchantment sign. Now I was really in the middle of nowhere. Continuing on US Route 380, I eventually found myself in Roswell. I could have gotten a few more hours of driving in and made it to Albuquerque, but I figured since I was in no rush, I might as well see what Roswell had to offer. Who knows if I would get a chance to visit again. As a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, as Mr. Ballen would say, I took a self-guided tour of the shops and attractions. The next day, I continued to Albuquerque, then westward on Interstate 40. By the time I reached Gallup and started northbound on US Route 491, I still had 2 hours of driving left before crossing the border into Colorado, and another 45 minutes before I would get to Cortez, my planned stop for the night. However, my daylight was already running out, as sunset was at 6 p.m. I got Starbucks and refreshed myself for the final stretch. It was supposed to be easy. Just a straight shot. But looking back on it now, I figured that, had I decided to stop in Albuquerque instead of Roswell the night previous, I would have already been in Colorado by now, and possibly be making my way into Utah. I would have saved myself from what was waiting for me on that desolate highway. Route 491 stretched far into the Navajo Nation. On either side of me were endless expanses of prairie bookended by dark indigo mountains on the horizon. To my left, the sky glowed a faint orange-purple, the light slowly dying down like smoldering embers in a fire, until finally plunging the land into darkness. Every now and then, I would see the forlorn headlights of another car passing by, which gave me a bit of relief that I wasn't alone. I also had my road trip playlist on to keep me company, and call me ironic, but Hotel California was playing. After passing the small, lonely town of Newcomb, the next piece of civilization would be Shiprock. However, between the two was a 36-mile stretch of absolute nothingness. An abyss I had to cross. I was not ready for what I was about to witness. After several miles, and having not seen another car on the road, I saw something strange emerge from the horizon. Barely lit by the moonlight, I thought it was a road sign at first. Then as I came closer, I realized it was a person, walking on the shoulder of the road, heading in my direction. I squinted, trying my hardest to focus on the figure. In the darkness, I could tell they were wearing a poncho of some sort, with long, black hair flowing down past their chest. Who could be walking out here, all alone, at night? I thought. Whoever it was, they had no lights, no reflectors, no strobes of any kind to signal to passing cars that they were there. And they walked on the pavement, dangerously close to oncoming traffic. I pulled to the left a bit, giving them a wide berth. Suddenly, my stereo cut out, as if I had turned it off. The screen went completely dark, and my phone disconnected from Bluetooth. While this was unusual, it certainly did happen from time to time, so I thought nothing of it. As I approached, I saw the person raise their right arm, as if to flag me down and hitch a ride. Oh no, I thought. There's no way that's happening, buddy. As my headlights swept by, I realized it was a man, dressed in a button-up shirt, a wool poncho, jeans, and cowboy boots. His large belt buckle glinted as the lights passed him. But in that split second, I realized with abject shock that not only were his eyes painfully wide open, but they seemed to be tracking me. Somehow, he was able to see me through the glare of my headlights and look me dead in the eyes, not breaking contact until I passed. I was shaken for a bit, but my nerves gradually subsided. My stereo abruptly turned back on and my music continued playing. I brushed everything off as simply my imagination. The darkness and the shadows playing tricks on my mind. Besides, The man was behind me. I figured he must have been drunk. Indian reservations sadly had high rates of alcoholism. I looked in my rearview mirror. He was gone. I couldn't see him. Maybe he's too far behind me? No, that couldn't be. It must be too dark. Maybe. I drove on, trying to figuring out what had just happened, but at the same time, forcing myself not to think about it. Just when I thought I had moved on, I saw another shape in the distance. Getting closer, I realized it was another figure. Another person walking alone at night? There's no way. They walked along the shoulder of the road, swaying back and forth. Slowly, I could make out that this person was also wearing a poncho. Then I saw what looked like long, black hair, reaching down past the chest. No. There's no way. It was the man. The same man. But how? The man raised his arm again, trying to flag me down. What did this guy want? I kept up my pace, with no intention of stopping for any reason. Just like last time, my stereo turned off again. Suddenly, the man leapt out onto the road, arms waving frantically. I swerved into the left lane, narrowly avoiding him. In my headlights, I noticed he had the same wide-eyed look, his gaze locked onto mine. I also saw that his clothes did not look as they did the first encounter. Once they were clean, if not well worn, but now they were soiled and tattered, rags barely hanging onto his withered frame. His hair was wild and unkempt, with clods of dried dirt stuck in the locks. But his eyes remained the same. My heart nearly burst through my chest at the sudden shock. Hyperventilating, I slowed down and glanced into the rearview mirror to make sure he was all right. Nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. The man was running. He was sprinting towards me. I centered the wheel and accelerated, hoping to get as much distance from him as possible. But as I continued to speed up, so did he. Faster and faster I drove, but every time I looked in the mirror, I would still see him right behind me, perfectly keeping pace, his body tinted red by my tail lights. I could feel my temples throbbing and my hands getting slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I was sick to my stomach. There's no way. I looked forward, hoping to see a faint glimmer of light from the town ahead. But I was still too far away. I looked back at the rearview mirror. The man was gone. I should have been relieved, but I knew better. Where did he go? I looked around, hoping to regain a visual on him. I couldn't see anything. Taking a deep breath, I refocused on the road, but kept my guard up. Just keep driving, I told myself. Only a few more miles to go. Out of the corner of my right eye, I saw something. Another shape. It wasn't the man, at least, I didn't think so. I glanced over, bracing myself for whatever was going to meet my sight. It looked like an animal. Some kind of animal, though I couldn't make out exactly what it was. Under the moonlight, I could see it running alongside my car, its forelimbs reaching out in long strides, its back undulating like a dog. Closer and closer it came. The closer it was, the more of it I could see. Little by little. Then I noticed, its limbs were far too long for its body. Its body was too short. It had no tail. The head was oddly round. And from it, came a trail of long, black hair. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing my car's engine harder than it had ever been pushed before. By now I was clocking well over 110 miles per hour. But this creature, it kept up. It wasn't phased. It simply ran faster and faster to match my speed. Just what was this thing? How could anyone or anything run this fast? The entity seemed to have endless stamina. Just how long could it keep this up? Just how much faster could it go? Soon, my car would hit its top speed. And then what? How long could it maintain that before breaking down? It wouldn't be long until my engine overheats. But regardless, I would eventually run out of gas. And when I do, what would happen if that thing got me? At 120 miles per hour, my car had reached its limit. This was the fastest I could go. But the creature continued its pursuit. My temperature gauge was approaching the red, and so was my tachometer. I couldn't keep this up any longer. Suddenly, like the beacon of a lighthouse on a tumultuous sea, the first light of Shiprock came into view. It was close. So close. If I could just go a little longer, I could make it into town. To safety. I pressed on. I fixed my eyes on the lights, growing brighter on the horizon. They bloomed outwards, glimmering in the night air. Though it was a small town, it was a sight for sore eyes in my situation. Looking in my periphery, I saw the undulation of the creature's spine as it kept pace with my car. But now, it was slipping away, steering farther and farther from the road. It suddenly hit me just how hard my heart was beating. Beads of sweat dripped down my face. I looked over. The creature was gone. But this time, the feeling of dread had also gone with it. My stereo once again turned back on, and as my music resumed, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. I let off the accelerator. The Manta creature, whatever it was finally gone for good. Having white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole time without realizing it, my hands were extremely sore. But I was glad to have made through. A week later, I told another soldier in my unit about what I had experienced. Being originally from Albuquerque, she was familiar with the Native American legends of the Southwest. The conversation steered toward a certain creature that she would not dare speak the name of. She also told me that the highway I took was well known for all sorts of paranormal phenomena. Google what Route 491 used to be called, and everything will make sense. Be careful out there. Posted by u/1_planch_man. My uncle used to be a trawl fisherman, until something unexplainable happened. Back in the early 1990s, my uncle worked on board a commercial fishing vessel out of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It was a 95-foot trawler, operated by a 7-man crew, and would take regular runs anywhere between a few days to a week out at sea. It was a dangerous job. The North Atlantic was a cold, cruel place. When you're 100 miles from shore in the middle of a storm, with waves battering the rusted hull of your boat your only protection from the fury of the sea, you really feel true isolation and terror. For those who aren't familiar, trawling is fishing method which involves casting a net into the ocean and dragging it steadily through the water, picking up anything that gets caught. The net would then be pulled out of the water and the crew would sort out which fish to take to market and which to throw back. Bycatch was very common. Oftentimes, other animals would inadvertently get caught in the net, such as dolphins, seabirds, small sharks, seals, and sea turtles. Those would be released back into the sea, but not without almost certainly being injured or killed by the net. It pained my uncle to see these creatures like this, but he was young and had to put food on the table for his new family. However, the ocean does not make it easy to do this kind of work. Commercial fishing was a risky endeavor. It wasn't uncommon for entire crews to die out there. That was a possibility that weighed on my uncle's mind every time a storm was brewing while he was at sea. One such trip finally made him quit, and to this day, the memory of his former friend and crew member still haunts him. It was supposed to be a short 3-day trip to bottom trawl for halibut. Being the dead of winter, the crew did not want to be exposed to the unpredictable weather for too long. The quote often goes, "If you don't like the weather in insert place, just wait 5 minutes and it will change." Everyone says this about their region, but the quote was first penned by Mark Twain, specifically about New England. The trip started on a brisk but sunny morning, but as the day went on, dark storm clouds gathered and stayed in the region for the entire duration. Out there, scattered showers pelted the crew and towering waves rammed and tossed their boat. The cold and the wet chilled their fingers to the bone, making a difficult job even harder. Then they began to notice barnacles spreading across the hull, starting at the bow. They were few at first, staying well below the water line. But as the day progressed, more and more appeared, growing unusually fast. Their captain, Mateo, was puzzled, for the crew had recently removed all of the barnacles before heading out. How could they return so quickly? But since that was an issue that was much lower on their list of priorities, they chose to ignore it for the time being. That first night, while my uncle was enjoying his 4 hours of sleep, he had an unusual dream, one where he was standing at the bottom of the ocean, looking up at the surface far above him. Though he was underwater, he was breathing perfectly fine. The light above was a pale pink-purple hue, shifting and pulsing with the flow of the water. All around, the carcasses of fish, squid, whales, and other sea creatures rained down in slow motion, leaving trails of bubbles in their wake. Then, the sea grew darker, enveloping him in a shroud of complete blackness. With it, came a long, deep rumble in the distance, which caused his entire body to vibrate. The light coming through from the surface faded, and right when the last inkling disappeared, he woke up. In the morning, he casually mentioned his unusual dream to the others, thinking nothing of it. But when they heard his story, their faces went flush and they reluctantly admitted that they too had experienced similar dreams. Though not exactly like my uncle's, they each saw their own version of it. Lancaster, the fisherman whom my uncle was closest friends with, said that in his dream, instead of standing on the ocean floor, he was hovering, with hundreds, even thousands of feet of water above and below him. He couldn't even tell there was a floor to begin with. Then, as the darkness closed in around him, and the grinding, bellowing noise came, he looked down. Slowly, the ground opened up, a yellow glow emanating from the newly formed fissure. As the fissure grew wider and wider, he suddenly realized what he was looking at was an enormous eye. Despite this, Lancaster and the others, being the tough-as-nails blue-collar men that they were, did not let their demeanors falter in front of each other. They brushed the dreams off and stayed focused on the work ahead. They still had several tons of fish to catch and a fat payout to chase. Lancaster, however, was especially quiet after that. That day, they were at the mercy of the waves, which came with more aggression than before. Some were nearly 10 feet tall and hammered the deck, soaking the men in freezing cold water. The barnacles had grown even more, and by now, they were beginning increased drag on the vessel. It was when the crew approached the continental shelf that things would take a turn for the worse. Right before the drop-off, the crew lowered the drag arms and tossed the trawl nets down, cruising at a steady 3 knots to drag the nets on the bottom of the ocean. All went well at first, until the starboard net had suddenly been caught. This was not usually a concern, but as hard as the crew tried, they could not pull it free. On the sonar, they saw a large, indistinct shape in the water, right behind their trawl. The outline of it was hazy, they couldn't determine what exactly the shape was. At first, they thought it was a shoal of fish, but that didn't explain what was keeping their net from moving. As they watched, the shape grew larger and larger. Matteo scoffed that the transducer must have been malfunctioning. They tried to reel the net in, hoping to cut their losses before it took too much damage, but the winch wouldn't budge. Whatever was holding the net in place, it was too strong for the winch to pull. By now, the engine was straining, and the stronger they pulled, the more the boat's starboard side was pulled down, tipping it dangerously into the water. Black smoke billowed from the exhaust as the engine began to shut down. In all the chaos, my uncle looked over at Lancaster and noticed he had completely blanked out. At first, my uncle thought he was frozen in fear, but that didn't make sense, because Lancaster had more experience than him, and was no stranger to high-intensity situations like this. He remembered how shocked Lancaster was in the morning, and realized something must have really gotten to him. But this was no time to ask. My uncle grabbed him and had him assist in hand-pumping diesel fuel into the engine until they could get the air out of the line. If the engine failed, they would be stranded at sea. Whatever it was that had a hold of the trawl net, it was unfathomably strong. Then, after struggling for what felt like forever, the net finally came free and the men were able to reel it in. On the sonar, the shape quickly withdrew, as if it was just an anomaly on the screen. They managed to revive the engine, and sped away from the area, not wanting to stick around any longer. The drag arms brought the nets up onto the deck, and the men quickly sorted through their fresh catch. Immediately, they realized among the creatures they had dragged up, was an enormous oarfish. An absolute monster from the deep. It looked to be about 30 feet long. Though it was dead, the body was still fresh, meaning it couldn't have died too long ago. One crew member, Isaac, wondered if that was what caught the net, but the idea was quickly dismissed because there was simply no way an animal could have done that, and the thing detected by their sonar was much, much bigger. Still, the men were puzzled by their very unusual find. Oarfish typically lived at depths of up to 1,000 meters, and would only come to the surface if they were sick or dying. On rare instances, they were caught by fishermen, or their carcasses would wash ashore. Another crew member, Ortega, warned that oarfish were bad omens, and that they should throw it back as quickly as possible. The others, including my uncle, objected the idea, and reassured Ortega that everything would be fine. They decided to keep the oarfish as a memento. After putting all of their catch on ice in the hold down below, they put the oarfish on a hook and hung the carcass with cordage from one of the drag arms. Looping their course back to shore, my uncle realized that Lancaster had been silent the entire time, and when his eyes weren't locked in a dead stare, he was constantly taking nervous glances at the oarfish. My uncle asked him what was wrong, but Lancaster didn't know. He just felt that there was something off about the carcass. A looming sense of dread that he couldn't explain. "We really should have thrown it back," he finally said. That night, the two were working together, as the others slept. Lancaster had grown increasingly distant, barely responding to my uncle, and when he did, he merely gave quick one-word answers. Multiple times my uncle caught him leaned against the railing, staring off into the inky blackness of the ocean. In one final instance, his head stuck out so far that it looked like one bad wave could send him overboard. My uncle had to stop him. He grabbed Lancaster by his shoulders and demanded, "What has gotten into you?" Lancaster, unfazed by the jolt he had received, asked in a calm monotone, "Do you see it?" "See what?" my uncle replied. Lancaster's behavior made him finally admit there was something deeply wrong with his friend. Maybe the sea was finally getting to him? Or was it something worse? He struggled to stop his mind from tumbling down a slope of possibilities he did not want to go. Lancaster simply continued staring, his gaze as empty as the endless void below them, as if to say that his silence was the answer. My uncle felt a chill run down his spine. He let go, afraid and unsure of what to do. "Sit tight," he said, shivering. The air was freezing cold as it had been the entire trip, but he did not feel it biting into him until this very moment. "I'll get Mateo, okay?" Lancaster didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to face the sea again. My uncle rushed below deck to wake the captain, who was a bit grumpy at first for being interrupted from what little sleep he had, but obliged to go up and help. Stepping out of the cabin, they stopped. Lancaster was gone. All that met them was the wet, limp body of the oarfish, swaying back and forth with the gentle rocking of the vessel. Its silvery scales reflected hauntingly in the pale yellow deck lights. Along its body was a massive gash, revealing its hollowed-out insides completely void of internal organs, like an empty discarded husk. They woke the rest of the crew, and soon all 6 men were desperately searching for Lancaster. They searched the entire vessel and shined their lights into the water in case he had gone overboard. Mateo swung the boat around, frantically scanning the water for any sign of him. Taking a closer look at the oarfish, their stomachs dropped when they realized it didn't look like something or someone had cut it open and gutted the carcass. It looked like something inside had torn its way out. Not taking any more chances, the crew cut the oarfish loose and tossed it overboard to be reclaimed by the sea. Following the disappearance of Lancaster, the Coast Guard led a massive search effort to find him. Sadly, they had to admit that, judging by the conditions of the sea at that time of year, he would have died very quickly from hypothermia shortly after entering the water. After that, scavenging marine life would have picked the body apart. Their only hope was to recover any human remains they could, any trace of him to bring back to his family. Sadly, nothing was ever found. My uncle expressed his condolences to Lancaster's family, and to this day, he deeply regrets leaving his friend all alone on that cold night. Posted by u/1_planche_man. We were stalked by a catacomb dweller in Paris. A few summers ago, I had the opportunity to study abroad in France. To say that it was an amazing experience would be an understatement. I absolutely loved it. For this trip, myself and 10 other students from my university, including our accompanying professor, would spend the month of June in Toulouse. But before our classes started, we would spend 4 days in Paris exploring and having fun. I didn't speak a lick of French going into this trip, but by the end, I would have learned quite a lot. This was because I never missed an opportunity to talk to someone. You'd be surprised by how much you learn a language by simply trying to speak to people in that language. I met so many people and had so many unique experiences because of this. We all did. However, there are times when someone you come across might be a little too eager to make friends. There are times when you have to know where to draw the boundaries. Our last night in Paris was one of those times, and thinking back on it, we were lucky, because things could have gone so much worse. After arriving at Charles de Gaulle Airport and getting settled in our hotel, we set out to explore the city. Over the course of those 4 days, we saw Musée d'Orsay, the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower and the Champ de Mars, Versailles, and Notre Dame, from a distance, as this was right after the fire, and of course, enjoyed the amazing food the city had to offer. We had more gelato and macaron than I could count. It was a great time. However, I had also wanted to take a tour of the Paris catacombs. Unfortunately, time was a concern and I didn't want to be out in the city alone without cell service to communicate with the others. On our last day, after dinner, some of our group decided to turn in for the night, to prepare for tomorrow morning's train ride south to Toulouse. However, 6 of us, including myself, will call the others Natalie, Dan, Ari, Maria, and Oscar, felt the night was still young. Besides me, everyone was under 21, and since France's drinking age is 18, they wanted to make the most of it. Overall, we wanted to enjoy Paris as long as we could. Besides, we could just sleep on the train tomorrow. We headed off, hopping from bar to bar until around 10 p.m., when we found one the girls liked. It was on a small, narrow stone brick road, lined with other small restaurants and bars, their outdoor seating areas filled with people. Inside, we found ourselves a round table and got drinks. I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the girls, Natalie, had been dropping hints on me the entire trip, and through my complete obliviousness, I had inadvertently rejected her and made her upset. As callous as it sounds, I wasn't really too concerned. I was having the time of my life. While I was waiting for my beer at the bar, a tall boy who looked roughly our age came up to me. He had curly brown hair and thick stubble. "Are you American?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, chuckling. "How did you know?" "Come on, my friend," he replied in a matter-of-fact kind of tone. "The way you look, the way your friends are acting over there, it is very obvious. Everyone here can tell." I laughed, slightly embarrassed, and we started up a friendly conversation. I found out that he was a student at Paris Sorbonne University, and worked in the metro during the summer. At least, that's what he said. After a few minutes, we had become friendly enough that I invited him to our table. He seemed very excited to meet everyone. Introducing himself as Hugo, he was an instant hit. Especially with all three of the girls in our group, who seemed immediately drawn to him. He was simply magnetic in the way he spoke and carried himself. His face seemed almost fixed in a warm, inviting smile, which showed off his nearly perfect teeth. Of course, the French accent certainly gave him charisma points. Natalie in particular was hooked. She almost never took her eyes off of him as soon as he sat down. After everyone introduced themselves, we began talking about our trip and what we were doing on our study abroad semester. We talked about the US and all the stereotypes associated with it, which brought laughs amongst everyone. Hugo became the life of the party, even offering to buy our whole table drinks. At one point, Dan and I even sang along when a song in English happened to be playing, which amused Hugo. Natalie was laughing the hardest at all of his jokes, even flirtatiously grabbing his arm and brushing his shoulder, though we weren't entirely sure if it was because she was tipsy or if she was actually into him. Hugo was well enough aware and bought her more drinks, mainly Moscow Mules, whenever she asked. He would just say, "Of course, mon cho," and pull out another euro banknote from the seemingly endless supply in his pocket. He offered us his cigarettes as well, thought it came as a surprise to him when he found out none of us were smokers. In one instance of attempting to produce another euro note from his pocket, he accidentally dropped something else out, the sound of a plastic material smacking the wooden floor of the bar. Ari was sitting next to him, and upon hearing the sound, reflexively looked to see what it was. As Hugo leaned over and reached down to retrieve the object, Ari quickly looked back up. Eventually, after hearing about our time in Paris and the places we had visited, Hugo asked us if we had been to the catacombs. I told him that while it was something we would be interested in, we simply never got around to it. "Oh, that is too bad," he said. "This is your last day too. And the last tour ended hours ago." "Yeah, it sucks," Ari said, though from her tone, she wasn't all too concerned. "Well, maybe next time. The catacombs are fantastic, I think you really should have gone." Hugo was suddenly transfixed on the topic, now that he had brought it up. "I love it. Imagine, a city of the dead, under our feet. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, much of them unknown." "No way, dude," Dan had probably had a drink too many, several drinks ago. "Sounds spooky," said Maria. "Maybe you should take us next time we're here." "Why wait?" Hugo paused, his voice suddenly slowing down. "Why don't we go tonight?" "What do you mean?" Ari asked. She could handle her liquor, and now she had suddenly sharpened up. I think we all knew what Hugo was implying, though none of us were willing to say it out loud. "I mean, we visit the catacombs. I can take you there. Think of me as your personal tour guide." Hugo's smile never left his face. "Yeah, totally," Dan shouted. "How?" I asked. "They're closed. And most of the tunnels are restricted." "Mon ami, trust me," Hugo said. "I go down there all the time. Me and my catacomb friends. We know the tunnels. We know how to get in. There are secret entrances all over the city. No one knows about them but us." By now my friends and I were looking over at each other nervously, not sure of what we should do. "That's very interesting, Hugo," Oscar said facetiously, trying to hint at him to change the conversation. But Hugo continued, "You will see it's true. Trust me. Tonight we're having a party down there. Lots of people. We have music, drinks, you want rosé? We have rosé. We have weed, ecstasy, blow, all of it." He looked down at Natalie, who was curled up under his arm. "You want to come, Moncho?" "I do," Natalie said, grinning. By now she was very drunk. Hugo turned to the rest of us. "See? Your friend wants to come." "Yeah, I don't think so," Ari said, her voice more stern. "Come on," Hugo said. "No, I think we're good," said Ari. "But Natalie wants to come, do not ruin the night for her," Hugo smirked. "That's just too bad," Oscar added. Because he wasn't much of a drinker, he kept his composure. "It will be fun." For whatever reason, Hugo was very persistent. "You will get to meet my friends. We will all be friends. No, I think it's time we call it a night, I said. I really hoped Hugo would not try anything. The night is still young. Hugo stood up, pulling Natalie onto her feet with him. He pointed to a door in the corner of the bar room. There is a secret entrance to the tunnels in the basement of this bar. The owner knows me. He will let us in. Hugo, we have to get up and catch the train tomorrow, said Ari, sighing. You will have time. Just come, stay with us a few hours. Hugo smirked again. Are you afraid the police will find out? They do not know the tunnels like we do. We're tired, buddy, I said, trying to keep the situation from escalating. By now I was sweating. The night this time of year was already hot, and combined with the stifling atmosphere of the bar, it was unbearable. We had a great time, but we need to go. Natalie, come on, Ari gestured to her. The two had already developed a strong friendship over the past 4 days. Natalie turned to Hugo. I think they want me to go. She began pulling away from Hugo, but he subtly pulled her back. Non, Moncho, he said to her. Come with me. I will take you back in the morning. She has to go. Ari's voice was stern now, almost as if she had suddenly sobered up. She can speak for herself, said Hugo, his smile finally beginning to falter, his facade melting away. Hugo, it was nice meeting you, Natalie said, no longer her flirtatious self. But I have to go with them. She tried to pull away again, but Hugo maintained his grip on her arm. Let go. Oscar's voice pierced through the noise of the bar. He glared at Hugo, darting his eyes left and right, non-verbally telling him that it wasn't a good idea to pull something like that in a crowded place like this. Hugo's smile was completely gone now. He fixed his eyes on Oscar, slowly loosening his grip. He turned to Natalie. Looks like this is where we part. That is too bad. Yeah, sorry, Natalie replied timidly. Come on, we're going back to the hotel, said Ari. Where are you staying? Hugo asked. Natalie began to reply, oh, we're at the... Natalie. Ari stopped her, grabbing her arm. Don't. She yanked her away, leading her out of the bar. Night-night, bud, Dan waved at Hugo, in his stupor, oblivious to what was going on. Outside, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was still feeling the tension from inside the bar. I was shocked at just how persistent Hugo was. I apologized to the others, realizing I should not have invited him to our table, but something told me he would have approached us anyway. Regardless, we were just happy to have gotten out of that situation. At least, we thought that was the end of it. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning now, and the streets were quieter. Natalie walked with an arm over Ari's shoulder, as she was too dizzy to keep her balance. As we made our way to the nearest metro station entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I was looking in every direction, occasionally glancing over my shoulder. Oscar must have noticed this, as both he and I were at the rear of the group, and gestured for me to look back. I stopped and looked, and in the shadow of a building, partially lit by an amber street lamp, was a tall figure. In the silhouette, I could see the figure had a head of curly hair. It was Hugo. The others heard us stop to look, and were about to look themselves, when I frantically whispered for them to keep moving and pretend we didn't know Hugo was behind us. Ari yelled a curse to him. She tried to rush us, quickening her pace and almost causing Natalie to trip. We had to get to the metro, fast. We had to lose him before he found out where we were staying. Ari finally spoke. Hey guys. I have to tell you. Back in the bar, he accidentally dropped something out of his pocket. I only got a quick look, but it was a driver's license. It was a California driver's license. The picture on it, it looked like a woman. What? Do you think he knows you saw it? I asked. I don't know. I hope not. Ari's voice wavered. What was he doing carrying around a California driver's license? Maria stammered. Where did he get it? Let's not find out. Several blocks down, I glanced back. He was still following us. I could see him walking at a brisk pace, while still remaining calm enough as not to arouse suspicion. As he passed in and out of the pools of light from the street lamps, I saw that he was diverting his eyes. Did he know that I saw him? We made it to the metro, quickly making our way down the stairs, through the turnstiles, and onto the platform to wait for the train. There was still a good crowd of several dozen people at that hour, so we tried our best to weave through them to hide. Ari, Oscar, and I continued to anxiously dart our heads toward the landing of the station stairs, hoping we would not see Hugo. In just a few minutes, the train arrived, and we rushed in, not wanting to spend a single second longer on that platform. After everyone had boarded and the doors had closed, I glanced over at the window of the door leading to the second train car. My heart sank. There he was, nonchalantly leaning against a pole, one hand hanging loosely from a strap. He looked up, and for a brief second, our eyes met. Oh shit. I quickly sat down, telling the others he was here with us. They panicked. There was nowhere for us to go. We couldn't leave, the train was already moving. Thinking quickly, Ari decided we would get off at the next stop. Our actual stop would have been the third one, but we couldn't let him know that. We had to get off as soon as possible to figure out how to lose him. Thankfully, that stop came up quickly, and as soon as the doors of the train opened, we rushed to get out, almost bumping into the people waiting to board. Briskly leaving the platform, we all could no longer resist looking over our shoulders, and when we did, sure enough, Hugo was there. He had gotten off as well, and was speed walking our way. Ditching the subtle act, he now fixed his glare on us, eyes peeled wide open. We rushed through the turnstiles, desperate to put as much distance between him and us as possible. Rounding a corner, we were relieved to finally see a police officer standing nearby. However, he wasn't just a normal officer, he was a member of the gendarmerie, more aligned with the military rather than civilian law enforcement. We called out to him, and instantly, he turned to look in our direction. However, he only paid attention to us for a split second before his eyes immediately darted to Hugo, who had nearly closed in. The gendarmerie officer broke out into a sprint, yelling police. Arrête! Merde, Hugo hissed through his teeth as he immediately turned and ran. We didn't have any time to process what had happened, because as soon as the officer had run past us, more officers, all of them gendarmerie, rushed into the metro. Some continued ahead to aid the first officer in pursuit of Hugo, while the rest, which were a team of Gigan operators clad in body armor and carrying rifles, gathered around an inlet in the wall. That first officer had been standing outside of that inlet, and now we could see it held what looked like a service entrance of some kind. The Gigan officers stacked up, carefully testing the handle. When they saw it was unlocked, one man slowly cracked the door open, checked inside with his rifle at high ready, and made his way in. The others followed suit. We realized that door must have been one of the secret entrances Hugo was talking about. Not wanting to stick around, and feeling it safe to return to the platform, we took the train back to our station and returned to the hotel. The next morning as we headed off to the train at Gare du Sterlitz, Natalie took one final look at our hotel, and let out a gasp that sounded like she had stopped breathing. There, spray painted on the front was a message reading, "I will miss you Moncho." Posted by u/1_planche_man. The Washington Entity. I'm an avid hiker. I've traveled all over the United States and hiked more trails than I can keep track of. Being stationed here at Joint Base Lewis MC Court in Tacoma, I have easy access everything the state of Washington has to offer. Every weekend during the summer, I make sure to go out and explore somewhere new. One of those trips shook me to the core, and to this day, I still have no idea what happened out there. It was Labor Day weekend, and we were given 4 days off of work. 4-day weekends are the best. I make sure to get as much time away to de-stress in the outdoors as possible. That Thursday morning, I had all of my gear packed up and ready to go in my truck, so that as soon as we were released from duty, I could quickly change out of my uniform and head off. Luckily, our company commander is pretty chill, so he let us out early, around 4:30 p.m. That gave me plenty of time to make the 3-hour drive out to the trailhead and get in a few miles of hiking before setting up camp for the night. I was going to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, between Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams. When I got there, I put all of my gear on, grabbed my trekking poles, and started on the trail. Though it was a 4-night camping trip, I was always prepared for up to 2 weeks in the woods, just in case I got lost and ended up as a missing 411. I had plenty of water, a purification system, food, a camp stove, a satellite phone, cordage, flint and steel, a survival knife, and emergency flares. This being bear country, I kept my food in a bear canister and wore a can of bear spray on my hip. I was also sure to make plenty of noise to warn any nearby bears that I was in the area. As a backup for absolute emergencies, I also had my Ruger 1911, chambered in 10mm. Say what you will, but I've never had to use it, and I hoped I never would. Until now. That first night, everything was amazing. I set up camp in a scenic location, had a fire going, certain campsites allowed fires, and enjoyed a chili mac dinner. It was great. When it came time for bed, I hung up my food, got into my tent, and drifted off to sleep. Something woke me in the middle of the night. A branch snapping. The sound was loud enough to actually wake me up, so it must have been a big one. Confused, I lay there, listening intently for what that could have been. Then I heard another snap, closer this time. An animal, it must be. A bear? Just my luck to encounter a bear on my first night. Then came the smell. It was awful. A horrific stench, like a rotting carcass. It wafted in, and lingered, as if whatever was making it was right outside. I heard more branches snapping, but this time, I couldn't pinpoint where the noises were coming from. They seemed to be all around me. But that couldn't be. Were there multiple animals? The horrific thought hit me that there could very well be a group of them outside, poking around. But before I could get worked up, the noises suddenly stopped. And with them, the stench. It just vanished. The air was clear again. I thought that maybe in my sleepy, hazy state, I had dreamt it all. Maybe I had sleep paralysis? Maybe. But I laid there listening until I fell back asleep. The next morning, I looked around my campsite, hoping to find tracks of whatever it was that came last night. I couldn't find any. No footprints, broken branches, no disturbed pine litter. I was completely baffled. How could an animal make all that noise but not leave any trace of them being here? Though it made me uneasy, I brushed it off and packed up my kit. I continued on the trail, and as I remember, I had a pretty great day. Then, it was nightfall again. As I was sitting by the fire, I heard a faint shrill cry off in the distance. It sounded like a woman screaming. A ghastly, blood-curdling scream. Startled, I looked in the direction I thought it came from. I don't know why, I couldn't see anything anyway. It was pitch black out there. The light from the moon and the stars couldn't penetrate the foliage. I thought it must have been a fox. Or a lynx. They tend to make scream-like vocalizations. Still, even if it was, hearing something like that while you're alone at night was still terrifying. I was expecting it to end just as quickly as it came, but whatever was out there continued screaming. It made long, mournful wails, piercing through the ambience of the forest. After what felt like 20 minutes, every rationalization I could think of no longer helped to calm my nerves. I couldn't take it. I couldn't stand hearing it. Then I heard a footstep behind me. The crunch of dry pine litter. I whipped around, grabbing my flashlight and aiming it directly into the forest. I started to sweat as I saw the beam was weak, fading in and out as if it was fighting to stay on. What cruel irony, I thought. I could have sworn I put fresh batteries in the night before I left. There was no way it could be dying now. In the flickering beam, the vast expanse of the trees was a curtain that hid everything from me. I swept it back and forth, watching the shadows sway and dance. There was nothing. I sat and stared, hand on my bear spray, waiting for something to jump out at me, but nothing came. As I calmed down, I noticed the screaming had stopped. Then a few minutes later, the crickets began chirping. Wait, has it been silent this entire time? I realized up until now, the forest was eerily quiet. Other than the mysterious screams, there were no crickets, no wind sweeping the foliage, no owls. Why didn't I notice it was so quiet? When did all that noise stop? Was it ever there to begin with? Completely baffled by what had just happened, I got ready for bed. In my tent, I checked my flashlight again. It was working perfectly fine. The beam was as strong as it was before the trip. Must be fluke, I thought. Though I was on edge, I still managed to fall asleep. But once again, in the middle of the night, I heard the sounds of branches snapping around me. They were closer this time, with the footsteps more frantic. Like the night before, the awful smell of rotting meat also accompanied them. This time it was so strong it felt like a cloud that was right on top of me. But there was something new. It sounded like someone laughing. It came from the same direction as the screams. I was confused at first, but as it got closer, I was absolutely sure it was someone laughing. Or at least it sounded like it. A high-pitched giggling laughter. Like a dog or a hyena imitating a human's laugh. Foxes could make a sound like that. Maybe it was a fox. Maybe the same fox that made the screams. Oh, who am I kidding? This was no fox. I had no idea what this was. At one point, the laughter sounded like it was right outside the tent. But for some reason, I could no longer tell where it was coming from. It was like as soon as it got close, it was somehow all around me. In my morbid curiosity, I sat up, contemplating unzipping the flap just a bit, to see and finally know what was outside my tent. But I quickly shut out that thought. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to know I was in here. Maybe if I stay quiet, it'll go away. So that was what I did. I sat and stared at the tent door, waiting, with the can of bear spray in hand. Though of what use it would be, I had no idea. Finally, like the previous night, it stopped. The footsteps and the laughing stopped, and the stench faded away. I sat there for some time, ready for it to come back, but it never did. I must have drifted off after that, because the next morning, I woke up lying down, still holding the bear spray. Searching the vicinity of my campsite, I once again found no trace of whatever was out there. However, my food canister was gone. I suspended it 20 feet in the air, but someone or something had taken it. Regardless, after the previous night, I was completely shaken and decided it was time to end the trip early anyway. I had planned a looping route, but it was faster to just go back the way I came. Still, that meant I had to endure one more night out here. With no food. Just one more night though, that was it. I could do this. That following night, I set up camp again and sat by the fire, warily listening for the screams again. This time I was in a more open area, a clearing on the edge of a rocky slope leading down to a lake. The sky was clear, with the moon and stars reflecting off of the water. Still, it wasn't enough to penetrate the forest. It was an abyss swallowing any trace of light that dared to enter. After I sat around for a while, I decided to go to bed early. I still had not heard anything strange, which gave me a bit of relief. I put out the fire. Suddenly a wave of dread swept over me. As the embers faded, so did the chirping of the crickets. And just like that, everything was completely silent. Then the screaming began again. This time, a single, long, piercing cry. It was much closer and louder than before. I looked up, staring into the darkness of the forest. Against the night sky, I could see the tops of the fir trees. They were moving. I heard the rustle of branches and needles, like they were pushed by the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still. And yet I could see the trees swaying. On the ground, I heard branches and twigs snapping, more viciously than the previous nights. The thing was big. And it was moving. Whatever it was moving. It was coming for me. It wasn't being sneaky, it wasn't creeping in the shadows anymore, it was making its move. Like a predator stalking its prey and making the final lunge. But how big was this thing? How could it be so strong that it was pushing the trees out of its way? The noxious stench hit my nose again, stronger than ever. I pointed my flashlight at the entity, trying to make out what exactly I was seeing. It was no use. As soon as I turned it on, light started drifting in and out like it did last night. Frustrated, I slapped it against my hand several times and turned it on and off, but it was no use. The light didn't stay on long enough for me to make out what the shape was. At the same time, the forest was so dense that whatever part of the creature that wasn't blocked by the massive tree trunks was still obscured by the branches and shadows cast by my light. Finally, as the creature came closer to the clearing, and its rough outline was visible, my heart sank. I saw a tall, humanoid figure, with long, gangly limbs, but no visible head. I couldn't tell if it was the darkness or my mind playing tricks on me, but there were no discernible features on it. It was completely black. In the beam of my flashlight, it still wasn't fully visible. When the light hit it, even thought it illuminated the trees, the figure was still in darkness. It was as if the thing itself was absorbing the light. Whatever light hitting it couldn't bounce off. It couldn't escape. An abyss. My flashlight choked out its last breath before finally shutting off. I was now in total darkness, with nowhere to go. I couldn't go around the thing, it was going to grab me. I couldn't go back, there was a drop-off. Navigating the rocks with no light was going to get me killed. In the glow of the moon, I saw the figure wrap a gnarled, spindly hand around the last tree, pulling itself out of the tree line. I heard the creaking and groaning and buckling of wood as it lurched its way forward. The eerie, uncanny laugh came, louder and more sadistic. It was inhuman, again, like an animal imitating a human's laugh. I froze. Now without the trees for contrast, I couldn't see the figure anymore. I just knew it was in front of me, and it was coming closer. But even though it was in front of me, the sound of its laughter seemed to come from all directions. How? If it was echoing off the mountains, I would be able to tell. But it seemed like the sound was wrapping around me. And so was the odor. With no other option, I had to fight back. I pulled out the bear spray and flicked the safety clip off. I aimed up at what I thought was the thing's face, and sprayed, holding the lever down until the entire can was empty. Unsurprisingly, that didn't seem to faze it. The creature kept coming. It was worth a shot. At least I'll go down fighting. It then quickened its pace, laughing maniacally as its body swayed and writhed, its joints creaking and clicking like old rotten wood. I dropped the bear spray and drew my 1911. I always carried with a round in the chamber and the hammer cocked. Ready to go. Flipping the safety off, I aimed with a firm, two-handed grip at the creature. The gun most likely wouldn't do anything, but I had to try. I fired. Once, twice, 3 times, over and over. Under the surge of adrenaline, I barely heard the gunshots as they rang out, but I could feel the force of the creature barreling towards me. Remembering back, I could have sworn I saw it reach out with a spider-like arm, fingers practically touching my head. I emptied the magazine. All 8 rounds, gone in what was probably the span of 2 seconds. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for what was to come. But right when I thought I was going to die, a sudden gust of wind smacked me. It was immensely strong, and felt like it was going to knock me backwards down the slope. The wind howled and ripped at my clothes. It was ice cold. I looked up, and the forest suddenly burst with light. A pinkish-purplish glow emanating from behind the trees. It lit up the sky and reflected off the lake and the glaciers on the mountains. It pulsed and shifted in hue, and seemed to flicker and dance like an aurora. I stared, completely baffled by what I was witnessing. Quickly, the light faded, and so did the wind and the stench. The forest was dark and quiet again, and the creature was gone. I sat on the ground, staring at the forest, trying to comprehend what I had seen. All I could hear was the ringing in my ears. Afraid that the creature might come back, I relit the campfire and waited for it. When my ears finally stopped ringing, I heard the crickets and other insects again. It was the most reassuring sound I had ever heard in my life. For the rest of the night, I sat by the fire, too afraid to go to sleep. When the first light of dawn came and the birds began chirping, I immediately packed up my camp to leave as soon as possible. Finally, I picked up my spent brass, and as I looked around, I tried to find any sign of the creature's presence. But like before, there were no footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed foliage. No evidence that an enormous creature had been there. I ran the entire way back to the parking lot. For miles, I ran with all of my gear on, disregarding the fatigue from staying up the entire night. As soon as I got into my truck, I drove all the way back to Tacoma without stopping. I had contemplated telling the guys in my unit about what happened, but I didn't exactly know what I would say. I didn't even know where to begin. None of it makes sense. I've searched all over the internet hoping to find an answer. Hoping to get some clue, or to find someone who has seen the same creature as I did. Like I said, to this day, I still have no idea what I encountered out there. But I do know that Washington, and the entire Pacific Northwest, is notorious for unexplained phenomena. Be careful out there.